June 22, 1941. 4 o'clock in the morning. The silence of the western border of the USSR is suddenly broken by the roar of thousands of guns. The sky fills with the drone of German bomber engines. Operation Barbarossa has begun, the perfidious attack of Nazi Germany on the Soviet Union. At the epicenter of the first strike was the Western Front, commanded by Army General Dmitry Grigorievich Pavlov. This front covered the strategically important Minsk direction, the shortest route to Moscow. It comprised 3 armies, mechanized corps, aviation, and artillery, over 600,000 men, about 2,500 tanks, over 10,000 guns. A powerful grouping intended to be an insurmountable shield against the aggressor. But in just a week, most of these forces would be defeated, encircled, or destroyed in a huge cauldron between Bialystok and Minsk. This battle would become one of the most tragic pages of the initial period of the Great Patriotic War. A catastrophe that would bring the country to the brink of destruction and open the road for German tank columns deep into Soviet territory. The Western Special Military District, transformed into the Western Front at the start of the war, represented a powerful military formation. Under the command of Army General Dmitry Grigorievich Pavlov were significant forces: 24 rifle, 12 tank, 6 motorized, and 7 cavalry divisions. Its arsenal included 2,200 tanks, about 10,000 cannons and mortars, and 1,900 aircraft. The personnel numbered 670,000 people. Structurally, the Western Front included 3 armies of the first echelon, positioned along the border. General Kuznetsov's 3rd Army covered the Grodno direction, General Golubyev's 10th Army, the Bialystok salient, and General Korobkov's 4th Army, the Brest direction. In the 2nd echelon was the 13th Mechanized Corps, and in the front's reserve, the 5th and 6th Mechanized Corps, concentrated in the areas of Bialystok and Minsk. However, the impressive figures concealed serious problems. Most tank divisions were in the formation stage. Only 15% of the tanks were of new types, T-34 and KV. The rest were outdated BT and T-26, vulnerable to enemy anti-tank artillery. The aviation also primarily consisted of outdated machines, and new aircraft were only beginning to arrive at units. The troop placement also played a fatal role. The Bialystok salient, deeply protruding into enemy territory, created ideal conditions for encirclement. At the same time, the main forces were concentrated precisely here, at a distance of only 15 to 20 kilometers from the border. This contradicted pre-war plans, which envisioned a deeper echeloning of defense. The front command found itself in a difficult position. Contradictory directives were arriving from Moscow. People's Commissar of Defense, Timoshenko, demanded increased combat readiness, but at the same time forbade carrying out measures that could be interpreted as provocative. Troops were in barracks, ammunition in warehouses, and anti-aircraft artillery at training grounds. Even when intelligence reported the concentration of German troops at the border, Pavlov was not allowed to bring units to full combat readiness. The state of anti-tank defense caused particular alarm. Fortified areas along the old 1939 border were disarmed, and new ones, along the border with Germany, were unfinished. Many pillboxes lacked armament, and there were no minefields or anti-tank ditches. Communication between units and formations was poorly organized, which would later catastrophically affect troop control. On the night of June 22, 1941, the Western Front met the war unprepared. Most commanders were unaware of the impending threat. When the first bombs fell on headquarters and airfields at 4 in the morning, a tragedy began that within a week would turn into one of the greatest military catastrophes of the 20th century. Operation Barbarossa envisioned the swift defeat of the Soviet Union in 8 to 10 weeks. For this purpose, the German command concentrated 153 divisions on the Eastern Front. Over 3 million soldiers, 3,600 tanks, about 7,000 artillery pieces, and over 2,000 aircraft. This armada was divided into 3 army groups: North, Center, and South. It was Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, that was assigned the decisive role in the first weeks of the war. It was to deliver the main blow in the Minsk direction, defeat Soviet forces in Belarus, and open the way to Moscow. Army Group Center included 2 field armies, the 4th and 9th, as well as 2 tank groups, the 2nd under the command of Colonel General Heinz Guderian, and the 3rd under the command of Colonel General Hermann Hoth. In total, 50 divisions, of which 9 were tank divisions and 6 were motorized. Air support was provided by the 2nd Air Fleet of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, which comprised over 1,000 aircraft. The strategic design of the German command was characterized by daring and scope. Guderian's and Hoth's tank groups were to deliver powerful blows to the flanks of the Bialystok salient. Guderian advanced from the south, from the Brest area, and Hoth from the north, from the Suwalki area. Having overcome the border defenses, the tank wedges were to rush eastward, bypassing the main forces of the Western Front concentrated in the Bialystok salient. The ultimate goal of the maneuver was the junction of the tank groups east of Minsk, which would lead to the encirclement of several Soviet armies. The infantry formations of the 4th and 9th armies were assigned the role of pinning down Soviet troops from the front and the subsequent elimination of the encircled groupings. A peculiarity of the plan was the rejection of frontal attacks on fortified positions. The Germans sought to use the tactic of deep breakthroughs, bypassing resistance nodes and leaving them to the care of subsequent infantry echelons. Tank divisions were to act as a powerful ram, breaking a breach in the enemy's defense. Each tank group comprised 3 to 4 tank corps, reinforced by motorized infantry, artillery, and sapper units. These were effectively autonomous armies, capable of independently solving operational tasks. The German command meticulously studied the disposition of Soviet troops. Intelligence reported that the main forces of the Western Front were concentrated in the Bialystok salient, which made them extremely vulnerable to encirclement. The Germans also knew about the unpreparedness of new fortified areas along the border and problems with anti-tank defense. Special attention was paid to the destruction of Soviet aviation in the first hours of the war. For this, detailed plans for strikes on all known airfields of the Western Front were prepared. German tank divisions were in excellent condition. They had combat experience from campaigns in Poland and France, refined interaction tactics, and high morale. Unlike their Soviet opponents, German tank crews acted cohesively, had reliable radio communication, and could flexibly react to changes in the situation. This advantage was to be fully realized on the fields of Belarus. June 22, 1941, 4:15 in the morning. The sky above the western borders of the Soviet Union filled with the roar of hundreds of German aircraft. Operation Barbarossa began with a massive strike on Soviet airfields. The Luftwaffe struck at pre-reconnoitered targets, airfields where units of the Western Front's Air Force were based. Most Soviet aircraft stood wing to wing in open areas, presenting ideal targets. Within the first 2 hours, German aviation made over 1,000 sorties. Bombs fell on 31 airfields of the Western Front. The results were catastrophic. Hundreds of Soviet machines were destroyed right on the ground. They didn't even have time to get airborne. By noon on June 22nd, the Western Front had lost over 700 aircraft, 2/3 of its aviation. The remaining machines tried to offer resistance, but their actions were fragmented and ineffective. While German bombers destroyed Soviet aviation, an equally dramatic picture unfolded on the ground. At 4:30 in the morning, after a short but powerful artillery preparation, Wehrmacht tank divisions crossed the state border. Advanced units moved behind a rolling barrage, methodically suppressing pockets of resistance in the border strip. In the sector of General Kuznetsov's Third Army, formations of Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group went on the offensive. German tanks broke through the defenses in the Suwalki area and sped towards Grodno and Vilnius. Soviet border guards and advance units of the 56th Rifle Division offered fierce resistance, but the forces were too uneven. By the end of the first day of the war, German tanks had advanced up to 35 kilometers deep. In the sector of General Golubev's 10th Army, the situation developed no less dramatically. Here, parts of the Wehrmacht's 9th Army broke through the defenses. They delivered a frontal strike on the Bialystok salient, tying down the main forces of the Soviet grouping. By evening, the Germans had penetrated the defenses up to 20 kilometers deep, creating a threat of encirclement for the units located in the salient. The most successful for the Germans was the offensive in the sector of General Korobkov's 4th Army. Here, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was operating, one of Germany's most experienced tank commanders. His formations broke through the defenses in the Brest area and rapidly advanced eastward towards Baranovichi and Minsk. The Brest fortress found itself encircled in the very first hours of the war, but its heroic defenders continued to fight. The reasons for such a rapid breakthrough of German troops were complex. Soviet anti-tank weapons proved ineffective against concentrated strikes of German tank wedges. Outdated 45mm anti-tank guns could not stop German tanks. The lack of air cover made the position of ground troops even more vulnerable. German Ju-87 dive bombers attacked resistance strongholds, artillery positions, and troop columns with impunity. By the end of the first day of the war, the command of the Western Front had lost contact with many formations. The front headquarters in Minsk received contradictory information about the situation on the border. General Pavlov tried to organize counterattacks with mechanized corps, but the lack of reliable data on the situation and communication problems made these attempts largely ineffective. The first day of the war ended for the Western Front with a heavy defeat, which would escalate into a real catastrophe in the following days. The morning of June 23, 1941, the headquarters of the Western Front in Minsk resembled a disturbed beehive. Army General Pavlov attempted to piece together fragmented intelligence about the troop situation, but the picture remained fragmentary and contradictory. The troop control system, the nervous center of any military operation, was paralyzed in the very first hours of the war. The German command perfectly understood the importance of communication and control. That is why, on the first day of the war, special sabotage groups, disguised in the uniforms of Soviet servicemen, deliberately destroyed wired communication lines. Simultaneously, German aviation delivered pinpoint strikes against known communication hubs and headquarters. As a result, by the end of June 22nd, most of the Western Front's formations were cut off from higher command. An atmosphere of tense anticipation reigned at the front headquarters. Telephones were silent. Radio stations did not respond. Only occasionally did fragmented reports break through about German tank breakthroughs, bombings, and the retreat of our units. But there was no overall picture of what was happening. The Chief of Staff of the front, General Klimovskik, fruitlessly tried to establish contact with the armies. "We haven't had contact with the 10th Army for 18 hours, he reported to Pavlov. With the 3rd Army, communication is intermittent. With the 4th, only through liaison delegates. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that many division and regimental commanders, having lost contact with higher headquarters, acted at their own risk. Some organized defenses, others tried to break out of encirclement, still others withdrew troops eastward. Coordination between formations was absent, leading to chaos and confusion. Pavlov took desperate measures to restore control. Liaison officers were dispatched to the troops in cars and U-2 aircraft. Mobile command groups were formed, intended to find Army and Corps headquarters, deliver orders, and return with a report on the situation. But these efforts yielded meager results. Many messengers did not return. They either perished under bombs and machine gun fire or found themselves encircled. By the evening of June 23rd, an alarming message was received at the front headquarters. Guderian's tank divisions had broken through Baranovichi and were continuing their advance on Minsk. Simultaneously, Goth's tanks were approaching the capital of Belarus from the north. It became evident that the Germans were implementing a plan to encircle the main forces of the Western Front. Pavlov tried to organize counterattacks with mechanized corps, but the lack of communication made this task almost impossible. Orders either did not reach their recipients or arrived too late, when the situation had already radically changed. "We were as if blind and deaf," one of the front staff officers later recalled. "The commander demanded information, but it simply wasn't there. We didn't know where our troops were and where the enemy was." Under these conditions, it was impossible to make informed decisions. The Western Front was turning into scattered pockets of resistance, not connected by a single design or plan. German tank wedges rapidly advanced, bypassing these pockets and rushing towards their intended targets. The morning of June 24th. The dusty roads of Grodno region are shuddering under the tracks of Soviet tanks. Major General Mikhail Kotskelevich's 6th Mechanized Corps is hastily moving to the front line. The order of the Western Front commander is categorical. Launch a counterattack against the breakthrough German tank units in the Grodno area. Stop the advance of Goth's 3rd Panzer Group. However, the situation is developing dramatically. The mechanized corps of the Western Front are entering battle disjointedly, without proper reconnaissance and air cover. Tank crews do not know the exact location of the enemy, and commanders have no communication between units. The sky completely belongs to German aircraft. Ju-87 dive bombers, unhindered, attack Soviet columns. Lieutenant Ivan Drozd, commander of a tank platoon, recalled, "We moved to the front under continuous airstrikes. Many vehicles caught fire without firing a single shot at the enemy. We didn't see our fighters. It was like an execution." The situation was exacerbated by a critical shortage of fuel and ammunition. Many tanks stopped on the routes of advance due to empty tanks. Technical problems plagued Soviet mechanized units. The newest KV and T-34 tanks often broke down due to mechanical malfunctions. Crews did not have sufficient experience operating these machines. When the advanced units of the 6th Mechanized Corps finally engaged German tanks, another critical advantage of the enemy was revealed: superior tactics. German tank units acted cohesively, supporting each other with fire. Each vehicle had a radio station, which allowed commanders to coordinate actions in battle. Soviet tank crews, however, often went on the attack without a clear plan, relying on the personal courage of the crews. Tank Company Commander Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Klimov wrote in his memoirs, "We attacked the Germans head-on, as we were taught. But the enemy did not accept such a battle. German tanks maneuvered, outflanked us, shot us from a distance inaccessible to our guns." Despite all the difficulties, Soviet tank crews showed exceptional courage. Lieutenant Sergei Konovalov's crew in a KV-1 tank destroyed 8 German vehicles in an unequal battle before being knocked out. Driver-mechanic Nikolai Popov, having received a severe wound, continued to drive his tank until he lost consciousness from blood loss. However, the heroism of individual crews could not compensate for systemic problems. By the evening of June 25th, it became obvious that the counterattack of the Soviet Mechanized Corps had failed. The losses were enormous. Up to 70% of tanks were irretrievably lost or required serious repairs. German tank divisions, having repelled the counterattack, continued their advance eastward, deepening the breakthrough. The tank battle near Grodno clearly demonstrated the advantages of the German war machine at the initial stage of the war. Superiority in command, communication, interaction of branches of service, and tactical training proved to be a decisive factor. But at the same time, this battle became the first school of combat experience for those Soviet tank crews who managed to survive. Experience paid for with blood, which in the future would help turn the tide of the war. On June 25, 1941, the German offensive entered a decisive phase. Wehrmacht tank wedges, having broken through the Soviet defenses at the border, rushed deep into the territory of Belarus. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group advanced from the south, from the direction of Brest, and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group from the north, from the Grodno area. Both groups had one goal: Minsk, the capital of the Belarusian SSR. The convergence of these wedges east of the city would mean the encirclement of the main forces of the Western Front. German tank divisions operated according to a method perfected in Poland and France. They did not engage in protracted battles with pockets of resistance, but bypassed them, leaving them to the care of subsequent echelons of infantry. The main thing was to maintain a high tempo of the offensive. The SS Reich Tank Division from Guderian's group bypassed Slutsk from the north, not even attempting to storm the city. When the commander of the Soviet garrison reported this to headquarters, they initially did not believe it. It seemed incredible that the enemy could simply ignore a major strongpoint. Such tactics disoriented the Soviet command, accustomed to linear strategy. German tank columns moved along the roads day and night. Crews slept in shifts directly in their vehicles. Stops were made only for refueling and minor repairs. The commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, General Lemelson, demanded of his subordinates, "Forward! Only forward! Minsk must be taken before the Russians come to their senses." Aviation played a decisive role in ensuring the German breakthrough. Air superiority allowed the Luftwaffe to strike at any targets. The actions of the Ju-87 dive bombers were especially effective. These aircraft, terrifying with the wail of their sirens during a dive, destroyed tanks, artillery positions, troop columns, and communication nodes. When the command of the Western Front tried to transfer reserves to threatened areas, German reconnaissance aircraft immediately detected movements, and soon bomb strikes rained down on Soviet columns. The roads of Belarus were littered with burning equipment and the bodies of the dead. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses proved insufficient to counter massive raids. By June 26th, Guderian's group had covered more than 200 kilometers from the border. The advanced units of the 17th Panzer Division reached the Berezina River. Another 120 kilometers separated them from Minsk. From the north, Hoth's tanks were approaching the Belarusian capital. The 20th Panzer Division broke through Molodechno and rushed towards Minsk. The distance between the advancing wedges was shrinking with each hour. The German command closely monitored the progress of its troops. Every evening at Hitler's headquarters, officers of the operations department plotted the new positions of the tank divisions on the map. The Führer was pleased. The operation was developing even more successfully than anticipated. He already envisioned a triumphant parade in Moscow. For the Soviet troops caught between the advancing German wedges, the situation was becoming critical. They were disorganized, deprived of communication with command, experiencing a severe shortage of ammunition and fuel. Many units retreated eastward in scattered groups, trying to break out of the emerging cauldron. But time was relentlessly working against them. The German tank pincers were steadily closing, threatening to snap shut east of Minsk. On June 26th, fierce battles unfolded on the approaches to Minsk. The Minsk fortified region, created in the 1930s, was intended to be the last line of defense before the capital of Belarus. The fortified region consisted of a line of reinforced concrete pillboxes, anti-tank ditches, and artillery positions, stretching in a semicircle west of the city. However, by the beginning of the war, many fortifications were in a deplorable state. Some pillboxes lacked armament, anti-tank obstacles were unfinished, and the garrison of the fortified region was only partially manned. Colonel Mikhail Pilipenko, commander of the 62nd Fortified Region, had at his disposal only 2 machine gun battalions and a few artillery units. catastrophically few for the defense of such an extended line. In a critical situation, the command of the Western Front sent consolidated detachments of cadets from Minsk military schools, NKVD units, and hastily formed workers' battalions to assist the defenders of the fortified region. Many of these fighters held weapons for the first time. Early in the morning of June 26th, advanced units of the Wehrmacht's 17th Panzer Division reached the fortified region from the southwest. German tanks stopped at the edge of the forest, awaiting the approach of reconnaissance and artillery. The division commander, Major General Ritter von Weber, did not want to risk his equipment by throwing it into a frontal assault on the fortifications. Instead, he ordered the Air Force to strike at identified firing points. Soon, dive bombers appeared over the defenders' positions. The ground shook from explosions. After the airstrike, German artillery opened fire. Methodically, pillboxes were suppressed one after another. By noon, German tanks went on the attack. They moved not in a continuous line, but in small groups, searching for weaknesses in the defense. Soviet artillerymen opened fire from the surviving guns. Several German vehicles caught fire, but it was impossible to stop the tank avalanche. Lieutenant Sergei Novikov, commander of an anti-tank gun, recalled, "We knocked out 3 tanks, but ammunition was running out, and the Germans kept coming. When the shells ran out, we resorted to grenades." In some sectors of the defense, hand-to-hand combat ensued. Cadets of the Minsk Infantry School, led by Captain Ivan Zubarev, held 2 pillboxes on the southern flank of the fortified region. Even when German tanks broke through to the rear, they continued to fire, cutting off enemy infantry. Only by evening, having exhausted all ammunition and lost most of their personnel, did the last defenders of these pillboxes perish. From the north, units of Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group approached Minsk. Here, the defense was held by units of the 108th Rifle Division and detachments of the People's Militia. The situation was complicated by the fact that many militiamen had no military training and were armed only with rifles. Against them acted experienced tank and motorized units of the Wehrmacht, supported by aviation. By the end of June 26, German tanks had broken through the defense of the fortified region in several places. There was a real threat of Minsk being completely encircled. General Pavlov, commander of the Western Front, ordered the evacuation of government agencies and the organization of defense within the city itself. However, it was already too late. The pace of the German offensive proved too high. Analyzing the reasons for the rapid fall of the Minsk fortified region, military historians identify several key factors. Firstly, the incompleteness of the fortifications and the weakness of the garrison. Secondly, the lack of air support and heavy artillery. Thirdly, the high mobility of German tank formations, which allowed them to quickly find and exploit weaknesses in the defense. Finally, the general disorganization of troop control of the Western Front had an impact. Nevertheless, the defenders of the Minsk fortified region showed exceptional courage. Many pillboxes continued to fire even when completely surrounded. Their resistance allowed precious time to be gained for the evacuation of part of the civilian population and material assets from Minsk. On June 27th, German tank divisions burst into Minsk from the north and south. The last pockets of resistance in the city were suppressed by the evening of the same day. The capital of Belarus fell. But the main catastrophe was yet to come. The Wehrmacht's tank pincers were about to close east of the city, completing the encirclement of the main forces of the Western Front. June 28, 1941, became the day when the fate of the Western Front was finally sealed. Early in the morning, advanced units of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group burst into the southern quarters of Minsk. Simultaneously, from the north, tanks of the 20th Panzer Division from Hoth's group entered the city. Nazi flags were hoisted over the capital of Belarus. The city, which only a week ago had been living a peaceful life, turned into an arena of fierce street battles. Isolated groups of Soviet soldiers, militia fighters, and NKVD units tried to contain the enemy's advance. They took up positions in brick buildings, set up barricades, and fired from basements. But the forces were too uneven. German tanks methodically suppressed pockets of resistance. They were followed by assault groups of infantry, clearing building after building. By noon, fighting was already raging in the city center, near the building of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Belarus and the Government House. Lieutenant General Bolt, commander of the 47th Motorized Corps, reported to Guderian, "Minsk is practically in our hands. Resistance is scattered, unorganized. We continue moving east." It was east of Minsk that events of strategic importance unfolded. While battles raged in the city, advanced units of Guderian's and Hoth's tank groups continued to move towards each other. The 17th Panzer Division from Guderian's group and the 20th Panzer Division from Hoth's group had orders to link up in the Smolovichi area, 30 kilometers east of the Belarusian capital. At 14:30 on June 28th, reconnaissance battalions of these divisions met on the Minsk-Moscow highway. The tank pincers closed. The trap snapped shut. Three armies of the Western Front, the 3rd, 10th, and part of the 4th, found themselves in a gigantic cauldron. German officers opened champagne, celebrating their success. Colonel General Guderian personally arrived at the junction of the tank wedges. That evening, he sent a radiogram to Berlin. Mission accomplished. Encirclement completed. According to preliminary estimates, there are at least 20 Soviet divisions in the cauldron. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. Over 300,000 Soviet soldiers and officers, thousands of armored vehicles, artillery, and motor transport were encircled. The main forces of the Western Front ceased to exist as an organized military force. At the front headquarters, hastily moved from Minsk to Mogilev, an atmosphere of shock and confusion reigned. General Pavlov tried to gather information about the situation of the encircled troops, but communication with most units was absent. Only isolated radiograms broke through from the cauldron, painting a picture of growing chaos. The commander of the 10th Army, General Golubev, reported, "The army is dismembered into separate groups. Ammunition is running out. Enemy aviation is delivering continuous strikes. Request instructions." Pavlov ordered the encircled troops to break through to the east by all possible means. But this order reached only a few commanders. Most units acted without centralized command, relying on the initiative of junior officers. On the evening of June 28th, Pavlov received an encrypted message from Moscow. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command demanded an immediate report on the situation at the front and the measures being taken. The commander's answer was brief and tragic. "The main forces of the front are encircled west and southwest of Minsk. Communication with them has been lost. I am creating a new line of defense along the Berezina." The Stavka's reaction followed immediately. On June 30th, Pavlov was relieved of command and summoned to Moscow. His place was taken by Army General Andrei Ivanovich Yeremenko. The Western Front had to be practically recreated, from reserves transferred from the depths of the country. For the encircled troops, a new, tragic chapter of struggle began. Attempts to break out of the deadly trap created by the Wehrmacht's tank wedges. On June 30th, 1941, in Moscow, an oppressive atmosphere reigned in the building of the People's Commissariat of Defense. Army General Dmitry Grigorievich Pavlov, who just a week ago commanded the powerful Western Front, now stood before the military council as a commander relieved of his post. His face was drawn, his eyes sunken. He had barely slept in recent days, trying to rectify the catastrophic situation. Stalin looked at Pavlov with unconcealed anger. "How did you allow the front to be routed? Why didn't you organize proper resistance?" Pavlov tried to explain that the troops had not been brought to combat readiness, that communication was lost in the first hours of the war, that the Air Force had been destroyed at airfields. but his words sounded like excuses. A few hours after this conversation, Pavlov was arrested. Along with him, Major General Klimovskik, Chief of Staff of the Western Front, Major General Grigoriev, Chief of Communications, and Lieutenant General Klitsch, Chief of Artillery, were taken into custody. They were charged with cowardice, inaction, panic-mongering, and surrendering weapons to the enemy without a fight. The investigation was short. Already on July 22nd, the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR sentenced all four to the highest measure of punishment. The next day, the sentence was carried out. Pavlov and his comrades became the first high-ranking victims of the catastrophe of the initial period of the war. Was this verdict fair? Modern historians tend to believe that the command of the Western Front became a scapegoat for the miscalculations of the country's top leadership. Pavlov himself had repeatedly warned about the concentration of German troops near the border, asked for permission to bring units to combat readiness, but received categorical prohibitions from Moscow. Colonel Ivan Fedyuninsky, who fought on the Western Front, recalled, "Pavlov was an experienced commander who had served in Spain. But even he could not withstand the German war machine under the conditions that were created before the war." In the 2000s, the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation reviewed the case of Pavlov and his comrades. All of them were rehabilitated due to the absence of a crime. The court recognized that there was no treason to the motherland or deliberate sabotage in their actions. They did everything possible in a critical situation, but the scale of the catastrophe exceeded their capabilities. The tragedy of the Western Front leadership highlighted systemic problems in the country's defense organization. Repressions against military leaders could not rectify fundamental errors in strategic planning, troop training, and army equipment. It took months of the heaviest fighting and enormous sacrifices for the Soviet command to learn lessons from the catastrophe of June 41 and find effective methods to counter the blitzkrieg. By the end of June 1941, true chaos reigned within the Bialystok pocket. The encircled Soviet troops found themselves divided into many disparate groups. Communication between units was almost completely lost. Commanders of all levels attempted to organize resistance, but acted predominantly at their own risk. Colonel Nikolai Yeremin, commander of the 180th Rifle Division, gathered around him the remnants of his unit and soldiers from other parts. In a forest near Volkovysk, he organized an all-round defense. "Comrades, we are surrounded but not defeated," he addressed the soldiers. "We will fight to the last bullet and then break through to the east." Similar pockets of resistance emerged throughout the pocket. The commander of an artillery regiment, Major Pyotr Sidorenko, having lost most of his guns, formed an infantry unit from his artillerymen. They occupied a hill near the village of Zelva, and for 2 days repelled attacks by German motorized infantry. One of the main problems for the encircled troops was supply. Ammunition ran out catastrophically quickly. Artillerymen received strict orders. No more than 3 shells per gun per day. Tankers conserved every shell, opening fire only when certain. Infantrymen counted their cartridges. The situation with provisions was no better. Field kitchens were destroyed or abandoned during the retreat. Soldiers ate rusks from their emergency rations, and when those ran out, they gathered berries in the forest, fished, and asked for help from the local population. Belarusian peasants, despite the threat of execution, helped the encircled soldiers, bringing bread, milk, and potatoes. The wounded had an especially hard time. Medical battalions were overflowing. There was a shortage of medicines, dressings, and surgical instruments. Doctors and nurses worked day and night, often by the light of kerosene lamps or campfires. Military doctor of the 3rd rank Anna Sokolova recalled, "We operated in the open air. Instead of anesthesia, a glass of alcohol. Bandages were washed and reused. Many could have been saved under normal conditions, but here they died from blood loss or infection." The command of the encircled troops tried to establish control. In the Novogrudok area, Lieutenant General Ivan Boldin, deputy commander of the Western Front, gathered under his command the remnants of the 6th and 11th Mechanized Corps, as well as disparate units of rifle divisions. An improvised communication system was created. Mounted messengers delivered orders between units. Boldin organized a military council at which a plan for breaking out of the encirclement was developed. Topographic maps had been lost, so routes were charted from memory, using the knowledge of local residents. Scouts, disguised in civilian clothes, were sent to find weak points in the German encirclement. By early July 1941, the Bialystok pocket had become an arena of desperate struggle for survival. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers and officers, finding themselves encircled, tried to find ways to break through to the east. A critical question arose before commanders of all levels: how to lead people out of the death trap. Breakthroughs from the encirclement were carried out in several main directions. The eastern direction was most actively used, through the forests in the area of the Nalaboki Pushcha towards Minsk. The second direction was northeast, towards Velika and Polotsk. The third was southeast, through the swamps of Polesia. Each route had its advantages and difficulties. General Boldin's group, numbering about 10,000 men, chose the northeast direction. Before the breakthrough, Boldin gathered the commanders and set a clear task. We move at night, rest in the forests during the day. Reconnaissance goes 5 to 7 kilometers ahead. Artillery and heavy weapons that cannot be transported are to be destroyed. The wounded are to be taken with us. The tactics of the breakthrough depended on the specific situation. The wedge method was often used. The most combat-ready units formed the spearhead of the attack, breaking through German barriers. They were followed by the main forces with the wounded and convoys. The flanks were covered by specially allocated detachments. This tactic was successfully applied by Colonel Yeremin's group, which managed to break through German positions near the village of Krinky. The commander of the 180th Rifle Division, Colonel Yeremin, recalled, "We attacked the German barrier at 2 in the morning. Tanks went first, 3 T-34s and 2 KVs. Behind them were assault groups with submachine guns and grenades. We broke through but lost half of our men." Surprise played an important role in the success of the breakthroughs. Major Sidorenko's group staged a false attack from the south side of their camp, distracting the Germans, while the main forces moved north. The tactic of infiltration was often used. Soldiers in small groups of 5 to 10 people passed through German positions at night. The local population provided invaluable assistance to the encircled. Belarusian peasants became guides, showing forest paths and fords across rivers. They warned of the location of German units, brought food, and hid the wounded. Maria Petrovich, a resident of the village of Gorodisha, led a group of 70 Red Army soldiers through the swamps for 3 days, helping them bypass German posts. Not all breakthrough attempts ended successfully. Colonel Novikov's group, numbering about 3,000 men, tried to break through the Minsk-Baranovichy highway, but was discovered by German aviation. Dive bombers struck the column, and then tanks and motorized infantry approached. Most of the group died or were captured. Nevertheless, many managed to escape the pocket. By mid-July, about 20,000 soldiers and commanders of the Western Front had emerged from the encirclement. Among them was General Boldin's group, which covered more than 600 kilometers behind enemy lines in 45 days. The remnants of Colonel Yeremin's group also reached their own, about 1,000 men out of the original 5,000. The breakthroughs from the Bialystok pocket became an example of the incredible resilience and will to win of Soviet soldiers. In a hopeless situation, without communication, without air support, without sufficient ammunition, they continued to fight and seek ways to salvation. Their experience formed the basis of subsequent instructions for actions in encirclement, which saved the lives of many soldiers in the further course of the war. True heroes were born in the encirclement, people who, in a hopeless situation, found the strength not only to survive, but also to continue fighting, save comrades, and remain faithful to their oath. Their feats remained unknown for a long time. Archival documents were classified, and survivors were reluctant to share memories of the tragic days of 41. But today, we can tell about some of them. Foreman Ivan Sereda went down in history thanks to an incredible duel with a German tank. On August 4, 41, when his regiment was trying to break out of the encirclement near Minsk, the foreman was preparing dinner for the soldiers. Suddenly, a German tank drove up to the field kitchen. Armed only with an axe and a rifle, Sereda did not lose his head. He threw a tarpaulin over the tank's observation slit, creating the illusion that the vehicle was on fire. When the frightened crew began to climb out, Sereda captured them. For this feat, he was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. No less astonishing is the story of Lieutenant Dmitry Ovcharenko. Finding himself surrounded, he was transporting ammunition for his unit in a cart. On a forest road, he was stopped by a German patrol, 2 officers and 50 soldiers. When his rifle was taken away, and he began to be interrogated, Ovcharenko snatched a hidden axe and with one blow severed the officer's head. In the ensuing confusion, he reached the cart, took out grenades, and threw them into the cluster of enemies. Then, armed with a rifle, he pursued and eliminated 21 more enemy soldiers. Returning to his unit, he delivered not only ammunition, but also the documents of the killed officer with valuable information. Tank Company Commander Senior Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov showed exceptional courage and tactical skill. During the breakout from the encirclement, his 5 KV-1 tanks took up positions near the road along which a German column was moving. In the course of the battle, Kolobanov's crew knocked out 22 German tanks, and another 20 were destroyed by other vehicles of his company. This battle became one of the most successful examples of a tank ambush in the history of the war. A special page of heroism was the actions of medical personnel in the encirclement. Second-rank military doctor Vera Demchenko organized a field hospital in the forest near Volkovysk. For 10 days, she and 5 nurses operated on the wounded by the light of bonfires, using minimal medication. When the Germans discovered the hospital, Demchenko organized the evacuation of the seriously wounded on improvised stretchers. Under the cover of night, medical personnel and lightly wounded carried more than 100 seriously wounded soldiers out of the encirclement. The feat of the standard-bearer of the 186th Rifle Regiment, Lieutenant Alexander Romanov, became a symbol of resilience. When the regiment was surrounded, the commander ordered the banner to be saved at all costs. Romanov removed the cloth from the flagpole, wrapped it around his body under his tunic, and, as part of a small group, began to break through. For 18 days they walked through enemy lines. Romanov was wounded twice, but continued to walk. When his strength failed him, his comrades carried him in their arms. On July 29th, the group reached their own, and the regimental banner was saved. While tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers fought a desperate battle in the encirclement between Bialystok and Minsk, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command made frantic attempts to relieve the besieged troops. In early July 1941, a new defensive line was hastily formed along the Berezina River. Reserves were transferred here from the depths of the country, divisions of Lieutenant General Pavel Kurochkin's 20th Army. The 20th Army was formed in June from troops of the Oryol Military District. It included 4 rifle and 2 tank divisions. The equipment was predominantly outdated, and the personnel were insufficiently trained. Nevertheless, it was a significant force, capable, in the opinion of the Stavka, of launching a counterattack against the enemy's stretched communications. On July 5, Kurochkin received the order, with the forces of the 20th Army, strike in the direction of Borisov, Minsk, with the aim of relieving the encircled units of the Western Front. Only 2 days were allotted for the preparation of the operation. The counterattack began on July 7th. The 131st and 151st Rifle Divisions, supported by a tank group, attacked German positions west of Borisov. Initially, the offensive developed successfully. Soviet troops managed to advance 10 to 15 kilometers, liberating several settlements. However, the German command quickly reacted to the threat. Units of the 17th Tank Division and aviation were transferred to the breakthrough site. Soviet troops, lacking sufficient experience and air cover, came under powerful attacks from the air. Battalion commander of the 131st Rifle Division, Captain Sergei Volkov, recalled, "We were advancing when suddenly the sky darkened with German planes. These were Junkers and Messerschmitts. They literally hung over our positions, shooting everything alive. The artillery was silent. The shells ran out. The infantry lay down in the field, suffering heavy losses." After the airstrikes, a German tank counterattack followed. German tanks broke through the battle formations of the rifle units and reached the flanks of the advancing group. There was a threat of encirclement. General Korochkin was forced to order a retreat to the initial positions. The counterattack fizzled out, failing to achieve its main goal, breaking through to the encircled troops. The losses of the 20th Army amounted to about a third of its personnel and half of its tanks. Simultaneously with the actions of the 20th Army, General Timoshenko's group, advancing from the Mogilev area, attempted to relieve the encircled troops. It included units of the 102nd and 108th Rifle Divisions, reinforced by artillery. However, this counterattack was also stopped by superior enemy forces. Why were the Soviet counterattacks ineffective? Analyzing the reasons for the failures, military historians identify several key factors. First, insufficient time for preparation of operations. Troops were committed to battle from the march, without proper reconnaissance and artillery preparation. Second, the lack of air cover. The dominance of German aviation in the air allowed the enemy to strike at advancing units with impunity. Third, poor coordination between branches of service. The infantry often acted without the support of tanks and artillery, which made it vulnerable to counterattacks. Finally, the lack of combat experience among commanders at all levels had an effect. Many officers led troops into battle for the first time and did not know how to react quickly to changes in the situation. By July 10, it became clear that it would not be possible to break through a corridor to the encircled troops. The Stavka made the difficult decision to focus efforts on creating a new defensive line along the Dnieper to stop the enemy's further advance into the country. The encircled units had to make their own way out, relying only on their own strength. By July 9, 1941, the Bialystok cauldron had practically ceased to exist. German troops methodically compressed the encirclement, destroying the last pockets of resistance. The 57th Motorized Corps of the Wehrmacht was completing the mopping-up operation in the area between Volkovisk and Bialystok, while elements of the 9th Army were eliminating scattered groups of Soviet troops in the Novogrudok and Lida regions. Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, reported to Berlin, "The operation to eliminate the Bialystok encirclement has been successfully concluded. Enemy resistance is broken. The counting of prisoners and trophies is underway." The figures that soon reached the Wehrmacht High Command headquarters were staggering in their scale. According to German data, over 320,000 Soviet soldiers and officers were captured in the cauldron. Trophies included 2,800 tanks, 1,400 artillery pieces, and over 10,000 motor vehicles. The Germans called this operation Double Canny, comparing it to Hannibal's legendary victory over the Romans. The Soviet command long refused to acknowledge such catastrophic losses. Sovinform Bureau reports spoke only of heavy defensive battles and planned withdrawal to new lines. Only after the war, when archival documents were declassified, did the true scale of the tragedy become known. According to modern estimates by Russian historians, approximately 150,000 Soviet servicemen perished in the encirclement. Another 200,000 or so were taken prisoner. Irrecoverable losses in equipment amounted to over 2,000 tanks, thousands of artillery pieces and mortars, and practically the entire air force of the Western Front. Approximately 40 to 50,000 people managed to break out of the encirclement. They emerged in small groups, often unarmed, exhausted by many days of travel through forests and swamps. Many were wounded, suffering from hunger and disease. But even in such a state, they sought to return to duty to continue the fight against the enemy. Lieutenant General Ivan Bolden, who managed to lead a group of 6,000 men out of the encirclement, reported to Stavka. The men showed exceptional courage and resilience. For 45 days we marched through enemy rear areas, overcoming their barriers, hunger, and hardship, but their fighting spirit was not broken. German losses in the elimination of the cauldron were incomparably smaller, about 7,000 killed and wounded. This disproportion was explained by the complete air superiority of the Luftwaffe, superiority in artillery and organized actions. The Bialystok-Minsk battle became one of the most severe catastrophes of the initial period of the Great Patriotic War. Within 2 weeks of fighting, the Western Front as an organized military force ceased to exist. The road to Moscow was open. It took colossal efforts from the entire country to stop the enemy on the distant approaches to the capital. The defeat of the Western Front had catastrophic strategic consequences for the entire course of the war. The road to Moscow was practically open. German tank columns, having broken through Minsk, rushed towards Smolensk, the last major city on the way to the Soviet capital. Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, triumphantly declared at a meeting at his headquarters, "The Russians have lost their shield. Now Moscow lies defenseless before us." In the Kremlin, the scale of the threat was perfectly understood. On July 10, an emergency meeting of the State Defense Committee was held. Stalin, usually reserved and laconic, did not hide his alarm. The loss of the Western Front created a breach 400 kilometers wide. We do not have a continuous line of defense from Polotsk to Mozir. The enemy can freely advance to Smolensk and further to Moscow. On the map, spread out on the table, a huge void yawned where the armies of the Western Front had been located just 2 weeks earlier. Now there was nothing to close this breach. Reserves were only beginning to form deep within the country. Stalin made an unprecedented decision: to create a new line of defense along the western Dvina and Dnieper rivers. This required mobilizing all available resources. Divisions of the People's Militia were hastily transferred from Moscow and the central regions of Russia. These were yesterday's workers, engineers, students, many of whom had never held a weapon in their hands. Chief of the General Staff, Marshal Shaposhnikov, reported, "The 16th, 19th, and 20th Armies are being formed to cover the Smolensk direction, but they are not yet fully manned. We need to buy time." The construction of defensive lines began urgently. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, women, teenagers, the elderly, dug anti-tank ditches, built pillboxes and bunkers, and installed anti-tank obstacles. Work continued around the clock, 7 days a week. Every kilometer of fortifications could delay the enemy for at least a few hours. At the same time, industrial enterprises were being evacuated from the western regions. Factories were dismantled and sent to the rear, to the Urals, Siberia, Central Asia. Along with the equipment, workers and engineers were evacuated. This was a titanic operation, unprecedented in world history. The German command, encouraged by the success near Minsk, hurried to develop the offensive. Guderian wrote in his memoirs, "We felt that the Russians would not have time to create a new front. Every day of delay gave them a chance to organize their defense. Therefore, I demanded maximum effort from my tank crews." German tank divisions moved along Belarusian roads practically without stopping. Only in isolated areas did they meet resistance from scattered Soviet units. These battles were fierce, but could not stop the overall advance of the Wehrmacht. On July 14, advanced units of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group reached the Dnieper near Orsha and Mogilev. A new phase of the war began, the Battle of Smolensk, which would last until September and become the first serious test for the German blitzkrieg strategy. Analyzing the catastrophe of the Western Front in June of '41, military historians identify a complex set of interrelated causes of the defeat. First and foremost, the incorrect deployment of troops played a fateful role. The main forces of the front were concentrated in the Bialystok salient, which deeply jutted into enemy territory. This created ideal conditions for a double envelopment and encirclement. The German command brilliantly exploited this strategic error, directing tank wedges to bypass the salient from the north and south. Colonel General Heinz Guderian noted in his memoirs, "The Russians literally exposed themselves to attack. Their grouping in the Bialystok salient was doomed from the first day of the war." The second fundamental miscalculation was the absence of a layered defense. Most divisions of the Western Front were located 15 to 20 kilometers from the border, without prepared defensive lines in depth. When German tanks broke through the border strip, they did not have to overcome successive lines of defense. The path deep into Soviet territory turned out to be practically open. The unpreparedness of the troops to repel a sudden attack was also of critical importance. Despite numerous intelligence reports about the concentration of German forces, units of the Western Front were not brought to full combat readiness. Ammunition was stored in warehouses, equipment was in parks, and personnel were in barracks. When the alarm sounded, it was already too late. German bombs were falling on airfields and command posts. The destruction of Soviet aviation in the first hours of the war had particularly severe consequences. More than 700 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, without even having time to take off. This ensured the Luftwaffe complete air superiority and allowed German bombers to strike any targets with impunity. Ground troops were left without air cover, which catastrophically affected their combat effectiveness. An equally important reason for the defeat was the paralysis of the troop command and control system. The destruction of communication hubs and headquarters on the first day of the war led to the front command losing control of the situation. General Pavlov did not have reliable information about the position of his troops and the actions of the enemy. Orders did not reach the executors, and reports from the field did not arrive at the front headquarters. As a result, troops acted disjointedly, without a unified plan and coordination. Analyzing the technical equipment of the opposing sides, one cannot fail to note the qualitative superiority of the German troops. Although the Western Front had an impressive number of tanks, more than 2,000, most of them were outdated vehicles like the T-26 and BT. The newest T-34 and KV tanks accounted for only 15% of the fleet, and often broke down due to technical malfunctions. German tanks, although inferior to new Soviet models in armor and armament, had more reliable engines, better optics, and, most importantly, radios in every vehicle. This gave German tank crews a huge advantage in maneuver warfare. Shortcomings in the combat training of troops also played a significant role in the defeat. Many formations of the Western Front were recently formed and lacked sufficient experience. Commanders did not know how to organize interaction between branches of service, effectively use artillery and tanks. Tactical exercises were conducted according to stereotypical schemes that did not prepare troops for the real conditions of modern war. One cannot ignore the impact of repressions in the army on the quality of command personnel. Mass arrests of military leaders in 37 to 38 led to many experienced commanders being replaced by young officers who lacked proper training. Lieutenant General Ivan Boldin, deputy commander of the Western Front, wrote in his memoirs, "Many regimental and divisional commanders encountered a real combat situation for the first time. They did not know how to act in critical situations, got lost, made erroneous decisions. A comparison of the tactical concepts of the opposing sides deserves special attention. The German army embraced the doctrine of blitzkrieg, lightning war, based on deep tank breakthroughs and the encirclement of large enemy groupings. This concept was honed in campaigns in Poland and France. The Soviet military doctrine, on the contrary, was still oriented towards positional warfare, with the consistent dislodgement of the enemy from occupied lines. The idea of deep tank wedges, although discussed theoretically, was not put into practice. When German tank divisions began to bypass centers of resistance without engaging in protracted battles, the Soviet command was psychologically unprepared for such a turn of events. Summing up the analysis of the causes of the Western Front catastrophe, it can be said that it was the result of a combination of strategic miscalculations by the High Command, the unpreparedness of troops for modern maneuver warfare, and the enemy's superiority in organization, command, and tactical training. These bitter lessons were paid for with hundreds of thousands of lives of Soviet soldiers, but it was precisely they that laid the foundation for the subsequent turning point in the war. The experience gained in the catastrophic battles of the summer of '41 was carefully studied and taken into account when planning future operations. The tragedy of the Western Front became a harsh school for the entire Red Army. The fate of those captured during the Bialystok-Minsk battle varied. For most, capture marked the beginning of a long road of suffering through German camps. But tens of thousands of soldiers and officers managed to escape, pass through filtration camps, and return to duty to continue the fight against the enemy. Their stories are an important and long-silenced part of the war chronicle. Private Mikhail Karpenko was captured near Minsk at the end of June '41. After 2 months in a POW camp, he and a group of comrades escaped during transportation to work. Hiding in the forests of Belarus, they found a partisan detachment. Karpenko fought as a partisan for 6 months, and in the spring of '42, when the front line approached, the group of partisans crossed over to their own side. The vetting began. "We were interrogated several times," Karpenko recalled. "They were interested in every day spent in captivity and with the partisans. They checked testimonies, compared facts. A month later, I was assigned to a rifle regiment. I fought until victory, reaching Berlin." Lieutenant Alexei Voronov, a tank platoon commander, was severely wounded in battle near Grodno. He was captured, unconscious by the Germans. After a POW hospital, he ended up in a concentration camp. In '43, Voronov managed to escape with a group of comrades. Through Poland, they reached Slovakia, where they joined local partisans. After linking up with advancing Red Army units, Voronov passed vetting by Smersh and was reinstated to his rank. For his combat merits in the Tank Corps, he received the Order of the Red Star. But not all stories were so fortunate. Sergeant Pyotr Lagutin, after captivity and a successful escape, returned to the active army but constantly felt distrust. "I was not appointed to command positions, although before captivity I was an assistant platoon commander," he wrote in his memoirs. "In questionnaires, I always had to indicate the fact of being in captivity. It was a stigma for many years." For officers, the situation was even more difficult. Colonel Nikolai Eryomin, a rifle division commander who was encircled near Bialystok, managed to organize a breakthrough and lead out about 1,000 men. But after vetting, he was demoted to major and sent as a battalion commander. Only after a severe wound and displayed heroism in the battles near Stalingrad were his colonel's epaulets returned to him. Many former encircled soldiers and prisoners of war, after returning to duty, displayed exceptional courage, striving to wash away the stigma of having been in captivity with their blood. Statistics show that there was a high percentage of those awarded and recognized for bravery among them. They understood the price of freedom better than others, and hated the enemy with the passion of people who had seen occupation and captivity from within. After the war, the attitude towards former prisoners of war remained cautious. Many of them underwent additional checks, faced restrictions in employment and career advancement. Only in the 50s did the situation begin to change, and the full rehabilitation of most former prisoners of war occurred only after Stalin's death. The stories of those encircled in the Bialystok-Minsk battle are a reminder that war is not black and white. Thousands of soldiers and officers, captured not by their own will, later returned to duty and made a significant contribution to victory. Their path was doubly hard. They fought not only against an external enemy, but also against the distrust of their own. For many years, the Bialystok-Minsk battle remained in the shadow of other great battles of the Great Patriotic War. In Soviet historiography of the Stalinist period, this catastrophe of the initial stage of the war was practically suppressed. Official sources were limited to brief mentions of heavy defensive battles and planned retreat to new lines. The fate of hundreds of thousands of encircled soldiers, their feats and tragedies, remained outside the historical narrative. In the memoir literature of the first post-war decades, it is also difficult to find detailed descriptions of this battle. Military leaders who wrote memoirs tried to avoid sensitive issues, understanding the unspoken restrictions on covering the failures of the initial period of the war. Even such prominent military figures as Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, in their memoirs, only briefly touched on the events in Belarus in the summer of '41. The first attempts at an objective analysis of the Bialystok-Minsk battle appeared only in the '60s. Historians Andrei Grilev and Boris Telpukovsky, in their research, began cautiously to raise questions about the causes of the catastrophe of the Western Front. However, their works still bore the imprint of ideological limitations. A real breakthrough in the study of the battle occurred only during the Perestroika years. The opening of previously classified archives allowed historians to gain access to authentic documents of those tragic days. For the first time, reports of commanders of encircled units, combat logs, and command orders were published. In fiction, the Bialystok-Minsk battle was reflected in the works of Konstantin Simonov, Vasil Bykov, and Ivan Stadnyuk. The theme of encirclement sounds especially poignant in Bykov's novel, The Dead Don't Hurt, where the author, who himself went through the war, shows the tragedy of ordinary soldiers who found themselves in the cauldron. Cinema long avoided this topic. Only in the '70s did the first films appear that touched upon the events of the beginning of the war in Belarus. I Am From Childhood, by Viktor Turov, and Through the Cemetery, by Viktor Turov. In the post-Soviet period, larger-scale films were created. In August of '44 and Brest Fortress, where the events of the Bialystok-Minsk battle were mentioned in retrospect. Modern historical science offers a balanced and objective view of the events of the summer of '41. Historians Mikhail Melchukov, Alexei Isayev, Oleg Ryzhashevsky, in their studies, analyze in detail the causes of the defeat, the actions of the command, the heroism and tragedy of the encircled troops. Memoirs of participants in those events are published, many of whom remained silent for decades. Of particular value are the works of Belarusian historians Alexei Litvin, Anatoly Krivorot, Emmanuel Yoff, who, based on local archives, reconstruct a detailed picture of the battles on the territory of the Republic, the fate of the encircled, and the role of the local population in saving Soviet soldiers. Today, the Bialystok-Minsk battle occupies its rightful place in the historical memory of the Great Patriotic War. Monuments and memorial signs have been erected at the battle sites. Search operations are being carried out, and new names of heroes and victims of that tragedy are being identified. History is beginning to speak with a full voice, without omissions or distortions. The Bialystok-Minsk battle became one of the most dramatic lessons in 20th century military history. Today, decades after those tragic events, we can assess their significance not only for the course of the Great Patriotic War, but also for the development of military art in general. The catastrophe of the Western Front in June of '41 taught several fundamental lessons, the relevance of which has not been lost even in modern conditions. The first, and perhaps most important lesson, concerns the strategic deployment of troops. The concentration of main forces in a salient, deeply protruding into the territory of a potential adversary, created ideal conditions for encirclement. Modern military doctrines take this experience into account, providing for flexible echeloning of forces and the rejection of vulnerable salients on the line of contact with the enemy. The second lesson is related to the organization of troop command and control. The destruction of communication nodes in the first hours of the war paralyzed the command system of the Western Front. Today, military strategists pay special attention to the protection and duplication of control systems, creating fault-tolerant communication networks capable of functioning even under massive enemy impact. The third lesson concerns the interaction of different branches of service. Disjointed actions of infantry, tanks, and aviation in June of '41 led to inefficient use of available forces. Modern concepts of warfare are based on the principle of inter-branch synergy, where different branches of service enhance each other's capabilities, acting as a single mechanism. Of particular importance is the lesson on the role of air superiority. The destruction of Soviet aviation at airfields on the first day of the war predetermined the outcome of the entire operation. Today, the protection of air bases, the dispersal of aviation, and the creation of an effective air defense system are priority tasks for any armed forces. The Bialystok-Minsk battle clearly demonstrated the importance of mobility and maneuver in modern warfare. German tank wedges, bypassing resistance nodes and rushing deep into the defense, changed the understanding of the nature of combat operations. This experience formed the basis of modern concepts of deep operations, used by the armies of leading powers. One cannot but mention the lesson on the importance of moral and psychological training of troops. Despite the catastrophic situation, many Soviet units continued to fight in encirclement, showing exceptional courage. Modern armies pay great attention to the psychological stability of personnel, the ability to act in conditions of stress and uncertainty. The experience of breakthroughs from encirclement enriched military science with an understanding of the tactics of small groups operating in the enemy's rear. The methods of survival, camouflage, organization of ambushes, and sudden strikes, perfected by the encircled troops of the Western Front, found application in the training of modern special forces. The tragic experience of the initial period of the war led to a rethinking of the role of reserves. The absence of strong second echelons did not allow the German offensive to be stopped after the breakthrough of the border defense. Today, the creation of strategic reserves is a mandatory element of military planning. The Bialystok-Minsk battle also became a lesson on the importance of reliable intelligence information and its correct interpretation. Ignoring data on the concentration of German troops near the border had catastrophic consequences. Modern armed forces invest significant resources in the development of intelligence capabilities and analytical systems. Finally, the events of June of '41 highlighted the importance of the technological factor in war. The superiority of German troops in communication, means, optical devices, and tactical mobility played a decisive role in the outcome of the battle. Today, technological superiority is a key element of military power. The lessons of the Bialystok-Minsk battle were paid for at an enormous price. Hundreds of thousands of lives of Soviet soldiers and officers. Our duty is to remember their feat and sacrifice. Monuments and obelisks stand at the battle sites in Belarus, reminding us of those tragic days. Search teams still find the remains of the fallen, bringing the names of heroes back from oblivion. Military historians continue to study documents and testimonies of participants in the battle, clarifying details and restoring the full picture of events. The memory of the Bialystok-Minsk battle is not only a tribute to the fallen, but also an important element of military education. The study of this operation is included in the curriculum of military academies in many countries around the world. By analyzing the mistakes and achievements of the past, military specialists prepare for the challenges of the future. History is a harsh but fair teacher. The lessons of the Bialystok-Minsk battle, learned at the cost of enormous sacrifices, help modern armies avoid repeating the tragic mistakes of the past and develop effective strategies for defending their countries. The feat of the soldiers and officers who fought in a hopeless situation in the summer of '41 remains an example of courage and fidelity to duty for new generations of defenders of the fatherland.